A woman who worked as a lawyer named Kartika was seen asking permission from her stepfather named Hendro to uncover a murder case committed by a man several years ago. She also asked her stepfather to testify at the trial regarding the case because he, who worked as the head of a prison back then, knew the facts of the case. Previously in this case, it was suspected that there was an error in the judicial process of the case, so that the defendant received a severe sentence. Kartika had studied the case and got valid evidence of it, then she filed for a retrial to prove that the defendant was innocent. After she got permission from her stepfather, she went to meet some people to be invited to court. Shortly after, Kartika met a fortune teller named Zaki. At first, Zaki didn't recognize her and thought of her as a customer, but when she showed an old photo, Zaki finally recognized her. She then invited Zaki to meet some other people from the photo. Hearing this, Zaki was willing to meet them. Somewhere else, an old man named Jaipura was seen teaching children to recite the Quran. At that time, it was not only children who learning to recite the Quran, but there were two adult men named Yuminus and Atmo joining them to study the Quran there. After Kartika and Zaki arrived there, they finally got together again after not seeing each other for so long. Then, Kartika conveyed her purpose to meet them because she wanted them to present at the trial she was about to hold, a retrial of the murder case perpetrated by someone named Dodo Rozak. Hearing this, everyone agreed to accept her invitation to appear at the trial. A few days later, it was time for the retrial of the murder case to be held. At this trial, Kartika would prove that Dodo Rozak was not guilty. At the beginning of the trial, the judge allowed the defense attorney to explain the chronology of the murder in which the victim was a young child named Melody Wibisono. On March 22, 2002, a man named Dodo Rozak entered the house of an official secretly and then committed a crime by abusing and killing a girl. Allegedly, Dodo Rozak used a wooden stick to hit the victim's head, causing the victim to die. Then the lawyer emphasized that the retrial shouldn't be done because the case has been processed through a valid trial previously, and it was clear that the defendant had been proven guilty and given an appropriate sentence. After the defendant explained that, the judge then gave Kartika as the plaintiff the opportunity to explain his argument and show strong evidence that she would use to prove that the defendant, Dodo Rozak, was innocent. At this moment, Kartika will prove that the figure who used to be damaged is not a murderer as alleged by the defendant. She also said that all the previous evidence showing that Dodo Rozak was guilty was all invalid. Over the years, Kartika had analyzed and studied the case until she managed to collect valid evidence which she was about to convey in detail to the judge. That was why she emphasized that at the previous trial, there had been an error in the decision given to Dodo Rozak, so he received a very severe sentence. Hearing this, of course, the judge immediately asked her on what basis could she conclude that the decision of the previous trial had gone wrong. Calmly, Kartika answered the question from the judge by saying that she was a living witness who knew Dodo very well. She also said that in the previous trial she was not involved because at that time she was still a child and did not understand what was happening at that time. From her explanation, it was found out that Dodo Rozak was her biological father. Back then, when Kartika was still a child, she lived alone with her father who worked as a balloon seller. Dodo was different from everyone because he suffered from mental retardation. Even though her father's condition was different, she still loved him very much. Dodo would escort Kartika to school and pick her up every day. They had a unique farewell which signified the closeness between them. After school, Kartika always accompanied her father selling balloons before they returned home until one day they get a big order from the house of an official whose daughter would have a birthday. The girl's name is Melody Wibisono. It was known that Melody's father's name is Willie Wibisono, a party chairman of one of the parties in Indonesia. At that moment, several people were decorating the backyard for Melody's birthday celebration. On the other hand, Dodo was preparing the balloons that had been ordered. After all the balloons were blown, Kartika delivered them and collected the payment. At that moment, Kartika saw Melody telling her mother that her dog ran away from the house. Meanwhile, Dodo saw the dog and tried to catch it, but unfortunately, the dog kept running to the road and was hit by a motorcycle. Panicked, Dodo immediately took the dead dog and handed it over to its owner, but unfortunately, due to Dodo's strange behavior, he could not explain the reason why the dog died. He was accused of injuring the dog, so Melody's mother yelled at him. Shortly after, Willie came home. He looked panicked when he saw a commotion at his house. He immediately approached his wife and found out that his daughter's dog died. Willie immediately took his family to the vet, hoping that his daughter's dog could still be saved. Meanwhile, Melody's mother, who was annoyed with Dodo, immediately kicked him out. Kartika saw her father panicking and tried to calm him down. After that, they went home. That incident becomes the beginning of the conflict, where after a few days later, Dodo was resting after selling his balloons while having lunch right in front of Melody's house. Shortly after, he saw Melody, who just returned home from school, and at that very moment, he suddenly recalled the incident that made Melody's dog die. He then took the initiative to cheer Melody up by giving her balloons, hoping that she would not be sad, but he did it wrong by entering the house without permission and giving the balloon outright to her. Dodo's sudden appearance made Melody scared and immediately ran into the house. Dodo, whose intention was none other than to comfort Melody, innocently chased her while trying to give her the balloons he had made, but a few moments later, Melody had been lying down and Dodo was seen trying to save her. Unfortunately, at that time, one of the maids there saw him, who seemed to be harassing Melody, and immediately screamed. This made Dodo panic, but again, because of his limitation in explaining what had happened with Melody, there was a misunderstanding. He was seen as a criminal and was beaten unconscious. After that, the maid immediately called her boss and immediately contacted the police. After hearing the report, the police and medical team immediately went to the scene of the incident and immediately secured Dodo, while the medical team immediately checked on Melody's condition, but unfortunately, after being examined, Melody was declared dead. They then brought Melody's body for autopsy. This incident led to the arrest of Dodo Rozak. He was charged with murder and minor abuse. Willie received a report from the police and immediately went to the hospital to see her daughter. The death of his daughter made him furious, and through his aide, he asked the police that the killer of his child be given severe punishment. With his power as a politician, he could easily sentence the most severe punishment for the killer. On the other hand, Kartika was restless because her father had yet to come home. She could only wait for him to return, but until nightfall, her father still hadn't come home. This, of course, made her increasingly panicked and frightened. The next day, Kartika asked her neighbor, Ms. Eni, if her father had called to tell her where he was. Hearing this, Mrs. Eni replied that her father had not contacted her. At that time, a television program was broadcasting crime news which showed the scene of the reenactment of a murder case. Seeing that, Kartika seemed to realize that it was her father who was on television. To make sure, she went with Ms. Eni to the crime scene. The police were doing Melody's murder reenactment, but sadly, the police intimidated Dodo and forced him to do the scene as if Dodo had committed the murder. It didn't take long for Kartika and Ms. Eni to arrive. At that moment, Kartika immediately realized that it was her father who was being arrested by the police. After the reenactment, Dodo was put in prison for his actions while waiting for the court's decision. On the other hand, Hendra, who still worked as the head of the prison at that time, received documents related to the profiles of the prisoners who have just entered. At that time, Hendra saw Dodo's file, which showed that he had abused a girl and killed her. Hendra seemed to be furious. Hendra's anger climaxed when he met all the prisoners, and at that moment, Dodo suddenly begged to borrow a phone to call his daughter. That triggered Hendra to hit him. The prisoners were then put in their cells while Dodo was put in cell number 7. This is when Dodo met with his new friends Japra, Ashrul, Atmo, Yunus, and Zaki. They were all prisoners who were known to be very cruel. They didn't seem to be friendly at first with Dodo, as seen when Dodo just entered the cell. He innocently introduced himself there. Dodo didn't understand if the occupants of cell number 7 were violent criminals. The cell's leader was Japra, a prisoner who was respected and even feared by the police and prisoners there. When Ashrul took the document in Dodo's hands and then read out the crimes he had committed, they, especially Japra, were furious and almost beat Dodo. But when Ashrul read out the lawsuits on which Dodo was charged with the death penalty, all the prisoners suddenly became empathetic to Dodo. At a time when all the prisoners were visited by their families, there was this one prisoner named Octo who was visited by his men who reported that their territory was being disturbed by Japra's gang. It was discovered that Octo was a gang leader who controlled several territories and used to ask for payment from merchants who had a stall inside his territory. But since he was in prison, Japra's gang started disturbing his territory and this profit from the merchants decreased. Knowing that, Octo became vengeful towards Japra and intended to eliminate him. When the prisoners were having lunch, Octo was about to attack Japra with a weapon he made, but Dodo accidentally saw Octo holding that weapon and realized that he was going to attack Japra. When Octo was about to stab Japra, Dodo suddenly ran towards Japra because he wanted to protect him, so he was the one who was stabbed. After that, a fight between prisoners happened. From that incident, Dodo received treatment for a stab in his waist, but this incident also made him considered a brother by Japra because Japra felt that Dodo had saved his life. To repay Dodo's kindness, Japra then offered any request which would surely be granted, but because Dodo only thought of his daughter, he innocently asked Japra to bring her to the cell. Hearing that, of course, made Japra confused, but to repay Dodo's kindness, he promised to bring Kartika into the cell. Japra immediately ordered his men outside the prison to look for information on Kartika's whereabouts, and after that, Japra planned so that Kartika would be able to visit the prison by submitting a proposal to the head of the prison to hold a religious event which would be presented by the children, with the excuse of treating their longing for their children. Fortunately, the request was accepted, and a few days later, the prison held a religious event in the hall by inviting the students. Finally, Dodo would be able to meet his daughter. During the event, Jaipur ordered Atmo to kidnap Kartika and brought her to their cell after successfully kidnapping her. Atmo carefully brought Kartika into the cell by hiding her in a box. Finally, after waiting for Atmo, Dodo finally met Kartika. Seeing Dodo that hugged his daughter made Zaki envy him and wanted to tell the guards, but luckily, he didn't do that after seeing Kartika begging him not to tell the guards. A few moments later, they panicked because the event finished faster than planned because the Ustads, the chaplain who was giving the lecture, had a heart attack. Atmo, who got the information, suddenly rushed back into the cell and was going to bring Kartika back to the group of students, but unfortunately, when Atmo returned to the hall, it turned out that the students had already left. Finally, Kartika had to stay in prison. This, of course, made Jaipur panic because if she was found out by the guards, then Jaipur would get punished. The next day, Asrul, who had the ability in repairing a computer, was asked to help repair the prison chief's laptop. He then saw the wallpaper of the laptop. It was Hendro and his daughter. He then asked the guard there about Hendro's daughter. It was found out that Hendro's daughter had died due to illness, and after his daughter died, Hendro's relationship with his wife worsened. After repairing Hendro's laptop, Asrul was escorted back to his cell. But before that, the guard told him that a religious event would be held again later. Asrul thought that the event would invite the students as before. He then conveyed this information to Jaipur, and they immediately set a strategy to return Kartika, but later, it was found out that it was a different religious event. Of course, this made Jaipur and the others annoyed at Asrul, while Dodo was happy because Kartika had to stay in prison longer. Kartika's presence in the cell was finally found out by Hendro after seeing the photos from the last religious event where one student was missing. He immediately checked all the cells and finally found Kartika in cell number 7. Of course, this made Hendro furious. He immediately moved Dodo to the isolation cell while he asked his subordinate to bring Kartika to his office. One day, there was a commotion caused by Octo. He deliberately set fire to one of the cells. This action he did was a form of rebellion because he thought that Hendro let Dodo bring his daughter to the cell while he was banned from seeing his parents. The commotion caused the evacuation of the other prisoners to another building. Hendro tried to calm Octo down, but unfortunately, at that moment, Octo beat Hendro and dropped the cupboard right on Hendro's body. After that, Octo ran from there. On the other hand, Dodo, who was released from the isolation room, accidentally saw Hendro, who was trapped in a burning room. Dodo innocently sacrificed himself to go in and save Hendro until they finally managed to get out of there, even though both fainted due to lack of oxygen. From this incident, Hendro finally felt he owed his life to Dodo and did not believe that Dodo was a murderer after seeing his behavior in prison. Then Hendro began to study and investigate the truth of Dodo's case. Hendro also appealed to the court so that Dodo would be given the opportunity to prove that he was innocent. Not only that, Hendro also invited Kartika to live with him and brought her into the cell to meet her father occasionally. Hendro's appeal to the court was approved and his assistant conveyed the information to Jaipur. From there, Jaipur asked the help from his cellmates to help Dodo to reenact Miladi's murder to find the truth. The next day, Asrul began to move to find data from Dodo's case when he was asked to fix the computer in the prison guard's room. After finding the data needed, they began to illustrate the incident when Melody died. At the incident, Dodo met Melody to give her a balloon. But Melody was shocked and scared to see Dodo there. She ran towards her house and soon after, she screamed when her foot tripped over a rope on the floor, hitting her head on the table, and she fell into the pool unconscious. Hearing the scream, Dodo went inside and saw Melody was helpless in the pool. He took a wooden stick to pull Melody but didn't succeed, so he went into the pool and took Melody to the land. After that, Dodo innocently undressed Melody so as not to catch a cold because her clothes were wet. That was when the maid saw Dodo and thought that he was harassing Melody. After the truth was revealed, all the prisoners supported Dodo so he could be released. At that time, Hendro was watching them from a distance and was convinced that Dodo was innocent, but unfortunately, the appeal that he issued to the judge made Willie Wibisono angry and threatened him. He asked Hendro to withdraw his appeal, but Hendro was not afraid of his threats and would still fight for the truth. Threats and pressure from Milady's family were also felt by Dodo. After Willie failed to threaten Hendro, he bribed Dodo's lawyer to threaten Dodo so he would plead guilty at the trial. Of course, the threat made Dodo afraid. His fear grew even more when Willie threatened to kill Kartika when Dodo was waiting for the trial to start. When the trial started, Dodo was forced to admit an act he had never done, and from his confession, the court finally decided that Dodo would receive the death penalty. His friends felt disappointed, sad, and angry after they taught Dodo to tell the truth but ended up pleading guilty. All their effort was in vain as Dodo said that he had murdered Melody. No one knew that Dodo had received threats from Willie, but apart from that, all of Dodo's friends were moved to help him get out of prison. After they received information that Dodo would soon be sentenced to death, Japra, as leader of cell number 7, worked together with Octo to help Dodo escape from prison by making a hot air balloon that would be used by Dodo to get out of there. One day, when the prison held another religious event, they planned the escape. They had prepared the balloon and even invited Kartika to join Dodo to fly out of prison. Unfortunately, when they had just taken off, the prison became chaotic as the guards began pointing their weapons toward the balloon. Hendro immediately stopped them, but unfortunately, the balloon got stuck, causing Dodo and Kartika to just stay in place, and in no time the guards lowered them and the attempt to escape from prison failed. A few days later, it was time for Dodo's execution. The atmosphere in the cell became emotional as everyone took turns hugging Dodo for the last time as a sign of farewell. After that, Dodo was taken out, accompanied by Kartika, until they arrived at the exit, the place of farewell between Kartika and her father. Kartika didn't understand that her father would be gone forever. She could only encourage her father, but in the end, the separation between the two was heartbreaking. Dodo would be executed for a mistake he never made. Since then, Kartika was raised by Hendro until she became a lawyer and began to study her father's case while becoming a living witness to the error in the decision given to her father. In that trial, Hendro testified to defend Dodo. After everything was conveyed by Kartika and the evidence was very strong to prove that Dodo Rozak was not guilty, the judge decided that Dodo was innocent. After hearing the decision, Kartika was finally relieved. Even though her father had died, she could clear his good name and prove that her father was innocent.